Well, we welcome Matthias Meyer on if feedback is a gift, why does it never feel like one? This was a community showcase from the Call for Papers, and before I read the bio of this stuck out. It was a brilliant title. So welcome, Matthias.
Thank you. Hi, folks. My name is Matthias. I live here in Berlin. I'm a founding partner and executive coach at the Intentional organization where I work with my partner, Sarah, who lives over in LA, to help our clients who are tech founders, executives, and leadership teams become more effective leaders. Before starting this business a couple of years ago, I had previously worked as an engineer. That's how I started my career. Founded several companies here in Berlin, served as a CEO at one of them, and then worked as a CTO at the company that was then founded by my now business partner, Sarah. Oh, this is the same situation as last year. Okay. I think it moved. Okay. I'll hold on to both these. Together, we also authored a book to help other founders, executives build more effective teams and also just humane organizations and become more effective in their leadership and in their management, and just also looking out after themselves. The book is meant as a guide through the challenging yet perpetually reoccurring challenges and struggles that you come across as you grow and scale organizations, sprinkled in with lots of anecdotes from our own experiences and failures and struggles, and also a few of our clients. One of my favorite chapters in the book is about feedback, which is also one I want to talk about today. Oh, great. When I first worked as a founder and CEO and started hiring managers for the teams in our organization, a question I got from one of our new managers, also living in LA, had rattled me. They had asked me a very simple question: do you have any feedback for me? They also had said in the same conversation that they really need positive affirmations to stay motivated in their work. That question really put me on the spot as the then very early founder. I started something along the lines that I'll need time to process it and come up with a few things until our next one-on-one. And needless to say, until then, personal feedback really hadn't been on my mind at all. And in the end, "you're doing great" was the only thing that I could really come up with after spending some time thinking about it. Reality was, for me, that I had no frame of reference on their work and hadn't really focused on positive feedback at all. As a German, I just presumed that feedback is there to point out flaws, leaving the work to figure out how to improve things with the receiver. That was the extent of my idea of feedback. And also, there wasn't really a lot of time for me for feedback. I was the founder, just busy, and everyone, including me, spend a lot of time in meetings, which is, really what happens in most organizations. But in a small company like ours, I also just assumed that feedback wouldn't be necessary either. I just, in that kind of environment, I just assumed people would be self-starters and mostly guide themselves on the path to success for their teams, which was really my mistake. And when I offered that measly sentence of feedback that they're doing great, it must have felt to that manager like a gentle but persistent slap in the face, like I was completely out of touch with their work, which I was. It was clear that I had very little idea of what they were actually doing, what success looked like for them, and what would be positive progress in their work, and also where I could help them learn new skills or push things along on their path. And since then, my point of view on feedback has shifted significantly. Feedback can indeed be a gift, but it needs to be done well for that to be true. In reality, organizations and the individuals in them face all kinds of hurdles that make feedback seem more like something that must be done rather than something that's truly there to help people do their best work. And that's not just reflected in my experience, my clients are struggling with this as well. And my goal in this talk is to walk you through some of my experiences in making feedback less of a burden, more of a gift. I hope you walk away with some ideas on how you become a feedback magnet and how you can help your team build a better feedback muscle. So let's start at the beginning, which is generally and rarely not where the feedback conversation starts. When my report asked me for feedback back then, one thing hit me hard. We had never set expectations on what their work and responsibilities were supposed to be, nor how their success would be measured. I foolishly, expected this to happen automatically and to simply for it not to be necessary as a stupid early founder and CEO. I thought it'd be obvious what the role of a manager was. We could talk about that later if that was really the case. In my case, it wasn't. We also hadn't discussed what I or somebody else in the organization or someone, like a mentor or a coach could do to help them grow in their role and learn the skills required for effective engineering management. This has been reflected in many of my clients over the years, especially when they talk about low performers. I walk them back to the beginning, asking them what expectations they've set with the person who isn't performing. Did they know how they would be evaluated? More often than not, the answer was the same that I had to give myself back then. They didn't. They had no idea what was expected of them, what success would look like for them, and whether they could get any support on their path. And this is still the reality that I come across quite often in the organizations I work with. So my first step back then was to fix this particular issue and then move on from there in the feedback conversation. And that meant laying out the expectations I had for the role, their work over the next couple of months, and also for the specific projects that I had delegated to them or would be delegating to them after this conversation. Putting down expectations, though, doesn't always come naturally. As it can feel like you're micromanaging a person, you're actually telling them what to do. That's what it can feel like, but it's easy to avoid when you make it a two-way conversation. Inviting their feedback and also their own ideas on what would be reasonable expectations. And so what do I actually talk about when I talk about expectations? It means that we talk about what the exact expected result and outcomes are supposed to be, what success looks like, if you will. And outcomes can include documents, proposals, taking a different approach to managing their team, or successfully delivering a project that advances them in their professional growth. In this case, for example, on the management track. All that happens within milestones and timeframes that I set together with them. And these need to be realistic, meaning that we acknowledge that almost everyone's schedule is already full and that they need to make time to work on this or multiple new projects even. And lastly, we discuss what support they need for success. That support can come from me, can come from somebody else in the organization who might have experience with this or is more senior, or it can come from outside of the organization, from someone who can serve as a mentor or a coach. In the end, everyone will have clarity on what needs to be done and have a measuring stick for when things aren't going as expected. For feedback to feel like a gift, setting expectations is a first step, overlooked way too often. But what happens when these expectations are set? More often than not, it turns out very little. Just the other day, I had a conversation with a client about the much-dreaded performance season they're currently going through. They were struggling to look back at the previous 6 months and come up with meaningful feedback. Remembering all the work their reports had done posed a challenge for them, let alone figuring out what they had done well and what they should improve. For one of their reports, they had been given the same feedback for the last 3 years. That's 6 performance seasons. But nothing really ever happened. Nothing ever changed. There was no action on the feedback, not from the person who received it, nor from my client. There was no support in between those 6 months either. No help from the manager, no striking up a conversation of, hey, you've received this feedback now multiple times. What's going on? I don't know about you, but I've dreaded performance season as much as my client. It certainly seems well-intentioned, offering predictable check-in to tell your team how they're doing and offer corrective measures and maybe hand out promotions. But in reality, many folks are scrambling once or twice a year to come up with meaningful feedback for their reports, their peers, and also for themselves. 6 or 12, even 12 months are a long time, meaning that few will remember what the people around them have done well, what they can improve. This has gotten so bad that people are now turning to AI to create their own performance reviews or those for other people. So what can you do? Of course, the fix seems screamingly obvious. Instead of providing feedback only when it's mandatory for the entire organization, you set up a more regular cadence with the people around you. This cadence can be different, on feedback on their professional growth, on their work projects, and on whatever else requires an open flow of feedback. And here are a few simple steps, few ideas really, to improve the feedback cadence and also to be better prepared for that much dreaded performance review season. Once a month, make one of your one-on-ones all about feedback. Different cadence works too, but do keep in mind that the longer time you have in between, like in a performance review, the harder it'll be to keep track of everything that's happened. And in the meanwhile, to make it easier to keep track of feedback, keep a feedback log. I've done this. It's very useful. Here you collect feedback that you plan on giving to your team, to the individuals in it, and feedback that you have given in the past. That log also works wonders when performance review season actually does come around, and you need to look back at the previous month of everything that worked well and all the feedback that you've given the person. And lastly, assuming the goal is to make feedback more of a thing, to bring it more into everyone's minds, one thing I used to do with all my all-hands meetings was to build in shout-outs, where everyone on the team could contribute something and point out an individual or a team that's contributed something particularly great in the last couple of weeks. So feedback is now on the agenda more regularly. Great. But it may still not feel like a gift, because it tends to flow only one way. Assumptions and observations are treated as facts. Going back to the story about my client, that one person has been given the same feedback for 3 years now. That makes 6 performance reviews. People were frustrated having to give that feedback every time anew with nothing changing. But the performance review process only really asks for feedback on areas that others deem improvable. It doesn't ask for any suggestions on how to turn this feedback into something actionable, let alone encourage managers to discuss feedback that's been given plenty of times before with their reports. It's like a one-way street, a monologue where feedback flows in only one direction. The feedback is shared, nothing happens, same thing happens again with the next cycle. But then again, and this is what I ask my clients, has anyone actually asked the receiver about it? Has anybody checked in with them, supported them, helped them to figure out what to do with this feedback? It may very well be that the feedback frustrates the receiver as much as it does the person giving it, but that the receiver doesn't actually really know how to fix it or what to do about it. After 3 years of giving the same feedback over and over again, the performance review really felt more like a performance than anything meaningful. And for my client, rather than be frustrated or at this point just shrugging about giving the same feedback, like in our conversation, they could have sought out perspective, struck up a conversation with a report to see how they're perceiving the feedback, how they're receiving it. Could have asked the report a couple of simple questions and wouldn't have needed to wait for 3 years or longer to ask them. Rarely is feedback reflected upon in how it lands, what the receiver thinks about it, how they evaluate it, and what needs to happen for the feedback to be addressed. And 3 questions like these could be all that's needed to strike up a conversation around the feedback, rather than leaving it untouched until the next performance review comes around. And in addition to that, there's another little hack that can make feedback feel less like a monologue and more of a perspective, if you will. As the person giving feedback, it's useful to acknowledge that your perspective isn't the only one. You only see part of the whole of this particular person that you're giving feedback to. That can indeed be helpful for the receiver to uncover their own blind spots, but it also means that there's more to the feedback story that you as the giver may not know. It may also mean that your feedback may not actually be applicable or useful to them. But what can that kind of language look like? Whenever I give someone feedback, or used to as a manager, I start with this sentence. As your business partner or manager or peer or whatever my frame of reference to their position is, and within the limits of my perception, I offer you the following feedback. It's two birds with one stone with a sentence like this. You acknowledge that you only see part of the whole within the limits of my perception. And you also acknowledge that you offer them the feedback, implying that it's up to the receiver to do with it as they please. They may take it or not. And as a third dimension, you also make your frame of reference, your perspective, your view angle clear to that person in relation to their role. And sends a very different support message when you frame feedback like this, and it also frames your mind, your own feedback, when you think about wanting the best for this person as you come up with the feedback. But what comes after those three dots at the end of the sentence? Unfortunately, what follows isn't always specific or meaningful. That same client I talked about earlier had received their own feedback in the past. During a round of start, stop, continue, still the dominant approach to doing feedback. They heard suggestions like, continue to be the great leader you are, or start taking ownership of meetings. Start, stop, continue has a tendency to leave people with feedback that's lacking essence, something meaningful. It doesn't tell them anything about, especially in this example, about what they're doing well and what specific areas they can improve. The words ownership and leadership are, as mere suggestions or ideas as they're being used, they're basically meaningless. They mean different things to different people. But the fix here can then be quite easy, as many of these fixes are. But it does require everyone to put in more thought and effort into the feedback process. And making your feedback specific is one of those obvious fixes, and yet it's still so much easier to offer vague and lofty feedback that the receiver can't do anything with. And coming up with rules around what specific feedback can look like doesn't take much, though. Here are three suggestions that I've been using quite successfully and simply. Instead of talking, for example, about ownership in meetings, it's worth pointing out a meeting that actually went off the rails, or where the receiver, in this case my client, wasn't fully present and everyone else was reeling as a consequence. Which also points out the impact of their behaviors. For other folks, it can be useful, for example, to point out how continuing the same behavior for 3 years in a row hinders their prospects for professional growth, for example, as a manager. And lastly, actionable advice helps people feel supported and helps them gather ideas on what they can actually try to improve the situation or their own behavior. But here's the issue. All of that requires time and effort. Not everyone's skilled enough in feedback on their own. So instead of relying on start, stop, continue, the person seeking the feedback can help people focus their own feedback on specific areas. This also helps folks who don't have a well-developed feedback muscle yet. They may not know where to start or what to focus their feedback on so that it will have the greatest use and impact and meaning to you as the person seeking the feedback. But you can help people narrow down that focus by asking specific questions about specific areas where you know you want to improve. It helps people overcome one of the many barriers to give meaningful feedback. They have to spend less time thinking about what might be useful to you and can instead focus that time on giving you feedback that is truly helpful and meaningful. It does require the person seeking the feedback to spend more time thinking about what feedback they're looking after, what would be most useful to them in that moment. But in return, they should get feedback that is much more useful and actionable, which is, if you ask me, it's time well spent. And just maybe also start using start, stop, continue, and start asking more specific questions. But as a German who's founded and run organizations across the globe, there's another aspect of feedback that you can trip over with multinational staff that spans continents. That is how feedback is provided and perceived across different cultures. I already had many conversations around this at this conference, and it is one of my favorite topics to try and figure out. Me and my co-founders were at a leadership offsite once. The facilitator flew in from the United States, California to be exact, and he asked us to rate ourselves as a group, as a team, in areas like communication, trust, and collaboration. We could choose between needs improvement, good, and great. Most of us being German, we were rather self-critical and try to be humble as well, and we opted for needs improvement. In all areas, by the way. And when our facilitator heard the results, he was shocked by the bad ratings that we gave ourselves. Little did we know, as Germans, that needs improvement is almost, or even is, the worst rating in the US that you can give to someone else or to yourself. Folks from different countries and different cultures evaluate feedback very differently and also have different feedback needs. Some might crave more of the affirmative feedback, while others are only looking for the stuff that isn't working, stating their opinions bluntly and unfiltered, like Germans. Others prefer a shit sandwich, so they don't demotivate others or don't get demotivated. So here's a handy and also slightly cheeky guide to translate meanings between specifically the US and Germany. And obviously, there's a lot more even in the US that is worth paying attention to, but I found this a very simple and good starting point. If you look at this, in the US, our ways of feedback, ours being us Germans, could be considered radical candor. There's an entire book about it, but to us Germans, it's just candor. And here, we add in the Californian interpretation, where everything is moved up another notch. Even when you use the phrase pretty good, folks can still be offended and you think it's bad. I actually had a conversation like this in California while being in LA. And Sarah, my business partner, is fourth generation native Californian. She endorses this list. And the potential for disconnect continues. When working with a mostly US team, I provided feedback on documents that my reports came up with. And I initially stated, it's a good start. Turns out that in the US, that can be translated to, it's garbage, try again. Whereas, being German, I truly mean what I said. But the cultural interpretation of the feedback turned it into something very different in the receiver's ears. And mind you, these are only one or two dimensions of the difficulty of bridging different cultures. A very cheeky one at that. I've barely touched on two of them here, and beyond culture is feedback across genders, across generations, and all of the other dimensions that exist should have equal attention as feedback standards are set within an organization. And for more on these dimensions, and feedback and also the different parts of culture, highly recommend Aaron Meyer's book, The Culture Map. In the meanwhile, what can you do with your team to help address this or bring this more into people's minds? You can build an understanding of how different people on your team evaluate feedback. This can happen on the team level, can happen on the individual level. The goal of this exercise can be a shared protocol that people can refer to whenever feedback is given and also received. Norms in this feedback protocol can include how feedback is framed, internationally, how it's perceived, what the meaning of different words like needs improvement or it's garbage is in everyone's culture and background. It's worth putting all of that on the table and having discussions about it. And when you agree on feedback channels, what they can include how and where feedback is supposed to be given. Is that happening in private, face-to-face? Is it in a chat, next one-on-one meeting, and in all hands in front of everybody else, if someone prefers that? And lastly, you can set expectations around the time that's allowed to pass before feedback is shared. For instance, my partner Sarah and I have a time frame of 48 hours in our protocol where each of us commits to bring up an odd or uncomfortable situation or a disconnect between us with the other person. As a final parting thought, meaningful feedback can help propel people in their work forward. It can help a team create trust by bringing candor, whether it's the radical kind or the German kind, into their everyday collaboration. But implementing a good way of giving it is still one of the biggest challenges growing companies face. Hope I've given you some ideas today on how to improve the flow of feedback in your organization. And you'll find many of the things I talked about here and a lot more in our book, The Intentional Organization, which you can learn more about, download a free sample chapter, and find out links where you can buy it online on our site, intentionalorganization.com/book. Thank you.
Thank you.